Oral questions. Question orale. The honourable member for Regina Capel.
Mr. Speaker, families across Canada have been hit hard by Liberal inaction, and they want to get back to work. We know that the Prime Minister doesn't want our oil and gas developed. His own senior advisor, Gerald Butts, has repeatedly called for a moratorium on Western energy projects. A defeated Liberal candidate in the last election said pipelines make Canada, quote, America's dirty gas tank. That candidate is now the Chief of Staff to the Minister of the Environment. Instead of being embarrassed about Canada's natural resources, which employ so many people across the country, why don't they stand up and protect our jobs?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we recognize that people in Alberta, Saskatchewan and Newfoundland are challenged with changes in commodity and oil prices. We are working together with them. We know that the right thing to do is to help Canadians. I spoke yesterday with the Alberta Minister of Finance to see how we could work together, and I'm pleased to say that he understands that there is a stabilization fund that Alberta can apply for, and the potential is for up to $250 million. Should they apply, we would work expeditiously to move forward on that request.
Honourable member for Regina Capel.
Mr. Speaker, contrary to what the Prime Minister has said, the Conservative review process worked. It led to the approval of 4 major pipelines. And the proof is in the hundreds of thousands of jobs those projects created all across the country. This week, the Prime Minister has moved the goalposts. He has added months of waiting time and extra red tape. Why? Well, we know his own senior policy advisor has publicly called for 2/3 of Canada's oil and gas, quote, to remain underground. Will the Prime Minister admit that his new job-killing process is designed to block new projects?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, first, we want to set the record straight. There have not been pipelines to Tidewater over the last 9 years. That's right. We know that we need to have a new process, a process that engages Canadians, because we understand that Canadians need to have confidence in any measures that we take. We are working together with all constituents to ensure that we can actually improve our situation in this new government.
Right on. Honourable member for Regina Capel.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday we debated a very sensible Conservative motion that called on this House to support the energy industry in our country and the men and women who want to work. The people of New Brunswick, Alberta and Saskatchewan are overwhelmingly supportive of the Energy East pipeline. Will the Liberal MPs from those hard-hit provinces be free to stand up for their constituents? Will they be free to vote in favour of our motion? Will they be free to show how important, understand how important this issue is? Will the member for Wascana be free to vote in favour of our motion?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know the resource sector is very important to Canadians and our economy. At this time of low global commodity prices, Canadian families and communities are hurting. The solution is growing our economy and creating good-paying jobs. Our interim approach will help do just that. We know the only way resources will get to new markets is if Canadians have confidence in the review process. The stakeholders I have spoken to this week welcome the clarity and are committed to being partners in growing our economy.
Monsieur le Président, le rôle de Premier ministre ne se résume pas à être un simple arbitre. Les travailleurs du secteur de l'énergie et des ressources naturelles ont besoin d'un gouvernement qui travaille avec eux. Les projets comme Énergie Est ne doivent pas servir de jouet politique pour un gouvernement qui ne comprend rien à l'économie. Monsieur le Président, ce gouvernement peut-il s'engager à travailler avec les travailleurs qui sont inquiets au lieu de trouver de nouvelles façons de leur nuire?
Mr. Speaker, as you know, we have released 5 principles to provide clarity and assistance for the interim approach to projects in process. This will allow for further consultation with Indigenous peoples, communities, our provincial and municipal partners, and further, the Minister will be appointing a ministerial representative to facilitate this process and report back to him. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Monsieur le Président, n'en déplaise à l'actuel Premier ministre, on ne vit pas d'amour, d'eau fraîche et de selfie. Le devoir de tout gouvernement est de s'assurer que les Canadiens aient du pain et du beurre sur la table tous les jours. Malheureusement, ce gouvernement libéral est totalement incompétent en matière d'économie et son seul talent est de faire grossir le déficit à vue d'œil. Monsieur le Président, quand ce gouvernement fera-t-il preuve enfin de leadership économique pour aider des projets comme celui d'Énergie Est?
La ministre des Finances.
Mr. Speaker, we are pleased to say that we are showing economic leadership in this country. We have started off with an important first step. We've reduced taxes on 9 million Canadians. Our next steps will also be important. We're going to help the most vulnerable with the Canada Child Benefit, and we're going to make investments in infrastructure that will make a short, medium, and long-term improvement in our economy.
The honourable member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
Monsieur le Président, le gouvernement dit vouloir se baser sur les faits, mais il n'y a aucune étude d'impact économique du partenariat transpacifique. Mais malgré tout, il entend quand même signer cet accord. Ce n'est tout simplement pas responsable. Des études indépendantes ont démontré qu'il y aura des milliers de pertes d'emplois. Rien de bon pour réduire les inégalités. Est-ce que le ministre peut nous dire sur quoi il s'appuie pour signer cet accord qui va nous coûter des milliers de bons emplois au Canada?
Secrétaire parlementaire, le ministre du Commerce international.
Monsieur le Président, d'abord, merci pour la question. Nous avons promis lors de la campagne électorale de faire des consultations sur le PTP. Le PTP a été négocié en secret par l'ancien gouvernement et rejeté, même sans l'avoir lu par l'NPD. Et donc, nous avons promis lors les élections de consulter. C'est exactement ce qu'on est en train de faire, Monsieur le Président.
The honourable member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
Well, let's be clear, Mr. Speaker. The Liberals have never said no to any bad Conservative trade deal, not a single time. Now, as North American foreign ministers meet, the former Mexican ambassador has spoken out against U.S. tactics on the TPP. In the final deal, the U.S. got far better terms than Canada for auto, putting good Canadian jobs at risk. Now, independent studies say the Conservatives' lopsided deal could cost 60,000 jobs and will increase inequality. How can the Liberals possibly justify signing this bad deal?
The honourable Parliament Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we will sign this deal in order to proceed with consultations as we have promised the Canadian people. This deal will be studied in this Parliament in front of parliamentary committees, and we will continue to consult Canadians from coast to coast to coast.
The honourable member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie.
Monsieur le Président, le ministre des Affaires étrangères a signalé hier que le maintien du Bureau de la liberté de religion ne serait pas une priorité pour son gouvernement. Le ministre a du même coup mentionné sa volonté plutôt de défendre tous les droits humains, incluant la liberté de religion, comme un ensemble. Nous sommes d'accord avec ça, mais, comme toujours, le diable est dans les détails. Le ministre peut-il nous dire exactement son plan de match et son échéancier?
Secrétaire parlementaire du ministre des Affaires
Mr. Speaker,
étrangères.
thank you for the question. First of all, it's important to understand that the decision has not yet been made, but the promotion and protection of human rights, including freedom of religion, of belief, of conscience, is an integral part of Canada's constructive leadership in the world. We are currently looking at our options on how best to build on the good work that has been accomplished in this area and enhance our efforts to champion peaceful pluralism, respect for diversity, and human rights as a whole. Thank you very much.
Monsieur le Président, le traité sur le commerce des armes a été adopté par les Nations unies en 2013. Rappelons que ce traité-là vise à réguler le commerce des armes au-delà des frontières nationales et notamment à s'assurer que ces armes ne sont pas utilisées à des fins contraires au droit international et aux droits de la personne. Mais le Canada, lui, n'a toujours pas signé le traité et en fait, le Canada est le seul pays de l'OTAN qui n'a pas signé. Quand est-ce que le gouvernement va respecter sa promesse et signer le traité?
Secrétaire parlementaire.
Thank you very much. Of course, we were not an original signatory to the treaty, but we are more than pleased to be acceding to the treaty in due course.
The honourable member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, Canada is a leader among energy-rich nations, the 5th largest oil producer in the world, producing 3.6 million barrels of oil per day. Yet Eastern Canadian refineries import an astounding 86% of their oil due to lack of infrastructure. Energy East is an immediate, shovel-ready solution to this problem. Mr. Speaker, why does the Minister of Natural Resources actually believe that importing foreign oil is better than using Canadian oil and creating Canadian jobs?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Speaker, if we are going to attract investments, we need to sustainably develop our energy resources. Then we have to better engage Canadians, conduct deeper consultations with Indigenous peoples, and base decisions, Mr. Speaker, on science, facts, and evidence. Without the confidence of Canadians, none of these projects will move forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, we keep hearing Liberal platitudes and empty promises about job losses in Canada. Let's not forget 100,000 people lost their jobs. Albertans haven't experienced this kind of unemployment since the 1980s when Prime Minister Trudeau introduced the NEP. Mr. Speaker, when will the Minister of Natural Resources and his colleagues actually come up with a plan to support our energy sector and the workers who lost their jobs?
The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, we have committed to modernising the NEB and having a more transparent process. We understand that Canadians across the country are hurting, and indeed certain areas more than others. But when any Canadian hurts, we all do. The only way we have a long-term solution to this is to grow the economy. And, Mr. Speaker, we will do exactly that. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président, durant la campagne électorale, le Premier ministre aimait bien parler de transparence. Hier, les libéraux ont annoncé qu'ils allaient abroger 2 lois fondamentales pour la transparence syndicale, une sur le vote secret des syndiqués et une sur la reddition de comptes des grands patrons de syndicats. Monsieur le Président, comment ce gouvernement peut prétendre être transparent alors qu'à la première occasion, il abroge 2 lois sur la transparence syndicale?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reason for the repealing of the bills is that they were originally not formulated in accordance with democratic principles of consultation and need. These were political instruments to attack the labour movement. We're going to reset, fair and balanced platform and move from there. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président, pendant l'annonce de la ministre de l'Emploi, du Développement de la main-d'œuvre et du Travail, on a appris que des syndiqués ont été payés pour jouer les plantes vertes aux côtés du premier ministre durant la campagne et que les libéraux ont dû débourser 2 300 $. De plus, nous savons que des syndiqués ont été impliqués dans au moins 2 autres événements durant l'élection. Monsieur le Président, combien les libéraux devront rembourser au total pour leurs plantes vertes?
Le ministre de l'Emploi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand that there was an incident in Ontario. As soon as it was recognized, we complied with the election laws and reimbursed the money in total.
The honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, on a Friday afternoon right before Christmas, the government gutted the First Nations Transparency Act by removing all compliance measures. Without consequences, the law is useless, and band members are now denied access to basic information. How does the minister explain to band members that the Liberal government's commitment to transparency is empty rhetoric?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her question. But everyone, including First Nations governments, want increased transparency and accountability, Mr. Speaker. And we are going to achieve this through full partnership in working with First Nation leaderships and organizations. We all know that a top-down approach from Ottawa has not worked with First Nations governments in this country. We intend to change it, and we will work with them in partnership to get the agreements that are open, transparent, and accountable for all Canadians and for their membership.
The member for Kamloops, Thompson Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday in this House, the Minister of Public Safety falsely claimed that his government follows the law. But the fact is, the Liberal government is clearly ignoring the law when it comes to compliance measures for the First Nations Financial Transparency Act. Why are the Liberals telling band members that they have to go to court to get basic information that is available for all other levels of government?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are establishing a strong partnership with First Nation governments in this country. We will, Mr. Speaker, in the meantime, First Nation governments will continue their long-standing reporting of their audited, consolidated financial statements, Mr. Speaker, including chiefs and councils, including salaries and expenses, and it will be disclosed to the department and to the membership of those First Nations.
The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Speaker, speaking of following the law, the Conservative government's war on the environment may be over, but the impacts linger. We've learned that it's not just the NEB who's been failing to enforce environmental laws. As revealed by the head of Environment Canada's enforcement branch, poor morale, fear of reprisals have made officers reluctant or unable to enforce environmental laws, forced to turn a blind eye to even serious environmental violations. Budget cuts, layoffs, and intimidation have left enforcement officers unable to do their important job to protect Canadians. What action is the minister taking to restore the powers of her enforcement officers?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for her question. I think that the Honourable Member would have heard during the election campaign that there was a significant focus on re-establishing the capabilities of the Department of the Environment and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans with respect to science and with respect to enforcement, and we are working on plans in that regard. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In the last election, Canadians called for a better NEB process, but without defined targets and more information, the new government's going to make a longer process without making a better process. Key stakeholders are noticing. It's why the Mayor of Burnaby said he was severely disappointed with the new Liberal measures, and First Nations are saying that the new measures ignore critical risks to rivers, ecosystems, and streams. The Minister said she'd base her decision on science, but the broken system isn't gathering it. Why is it that she's willing to move ahead with a decision without evidence?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, we have said all along that the NEB process, the NEB itself needs to be modernised, and we need to review the processes. We have put in interim principles to address those projects already in process, and we will work with our other ministries, such as the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change and others, to make sure that we have robust protection for Canadians. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Mr. Speaker, just as question period was starting, we learned that Canada was left with a $392 million surplus in November. Don't take my word for it. The Finance Minister's own officials said it. In fact, from April to November, the federal surplus stands at $1 billion. Won't the Liberal Finance Minister just admit that Conservatives left Liberals a healthy surplus, and that in fact it's just bad economic management?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we had the challenging situation of coming into office after the previous government did not steward our economy effectively. We were left with an understanding that there was a surplus, but we found out that there was a deficit. They miscalculated where we were at. In my economic and fiscal update, we gave Canadians a clear and transparent understanding. We don't focus on 1 month, we look at the whole year, and it's quite clear that we're working from a position of a deficit left by the government on the opposite side.
Honourable Member for Elgin, Middlesex, London. Order. The Honourable Member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Liberals are threatening to run $10, $20, $30 billion deficits this year. The fact remains that Conservatives left Liberals a healthy surplus. It's only through runaway Liberal spending and planned job-killing increases that are putting Canada back into deficits. Will the Finance Minister take ownership and admit that Liberals have no economic plan for Canada?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, the previous government racked up $150 billion in debt for this country. We now face a deficit left by the previous government. Our plan is to actually take a new path, a path of growth. We're bringing money into the economy through tax cuts. We're bringing money into the economy through Canada Child Benefit, but we're going to stimulate the economy over time through our infrastructure spending in Canada.
Yeah. Honourable member for Prince George, Peace River, and Northern Rockies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a father of 4, I understand how important it is for families to be able to budget their own finances, but it's awfully difficult when you don't know what's coming in. We all know that the Liberal government has decided to do away with the UCCB that helps all families in Canada. Mr. Speaker, many Canadian families will no longer get this benefit. When will the minister come clean with Canadian families and tell them when their last cheque will arrive?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I want to say thank you to the member on the opposite side for giving me an opportunity to explain that we're going to introduce the Canada Child Benefit. It's actually going to focus on those Canadians with children who need help. 9 out of 10 families with children will be helped through our new benefit, and we will raise hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty.
Honourable member for Prince George, Peace River, and Northern Rockies. Order.
Speaking of those same families, earlier this week the Liberals announced those new roadblocks for resource projects. British Columbians are waiting for these important LNG projects to start. Now it will even take longer for these important Canadian jobs to be created in my riding and across the country. When will the Minister of the Environment admit that Liberals' disdain for natural resource development is hurting British Columbians, British Columbian families, and British Columbian jobs?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for the question. Earlier this week, the Minister of Natural Resources and the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change outlined the interim principles by which all projects will need to abide. And they essentially are about re-establishing the confidence that Canadians have in the process such that we can actually get to the point where our products can be exported. Those principles involve greenhouse gas emissions being associated with the product, being fully transparent. It involves proper consultation with Aboriginal communities and appropriate community consultation. These are the ways that we restore public confidence in the process such that these projects can move ahead.
The Honourable Member for North Island, Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberals promised to reopen marine communication centres in BC, closed by the Conservatives. But the Comox Coast Guard Traffic Centre is set to close March 31st, and the Liberals are still missing in action. The closure will put lives at risk in coastal communities. The government has a responsibility to keep Canadians safe. Will they commit today to keep the Comox MCTS Centre open?
The Honourable Minister for Fisheries and Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, marine safety is a top priority of the Canadian Coast Guard. Through modern technology, we've been able to ensure that no communications gaps will be in place and we'll still maintain that safety. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Courtenay Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative decision to close the Tofino MCTS Centre in Ucluelet left coastal communities without protection. My community is still reeling from the sinking of the Leviathan II and the recent loss of lives. This tragedy underlined that having local eyes and ears is essential for coastal safety. Liberals promised to restore the Coast Guard's ability to respond to emergencies. So will they back this up by immediately reopening the Tofino Marine Communication Centre?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'd like to reiterate that the Canadian Coast Guard's top priority is the safety of mariners and to make sure that the communications between the vessels and the monitors, that safety is there. The technology that we've included into our new system guarantees that safety, and it will always be there. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président, alors que l'économie demeure fragile, les familles de la classe moyenne ont de la difficulté à joindre les deux bouts. Les gens de ma circonscription veulent un programme qui va aider ceux et celles qui en ont le plus besoin, au lieu d'un programme qui aide les familles les plus nanties. Est-ce que le ministre des Finances peut-il nous indiquer comment il planifie d'offrir plus d'aide aux familles?
La ministre des Finances.
Monsieur le Président, nous avons commencé avec notre première étape, une réduction des impôts pour les classes moyennes. Ça va aider 9 millions de Canadiens avec une réduction dans leur impôt et plus d'argent dans leur poche. Mais la deuxième étape, l'allocation canadienne aux enfants, va améliorer la situation de 9 familles sur 10 avec enfants et ça va aider centaines de milliers d'enfants avec plus d'argent pour eux. De cette façon, ils peuvent vivre une meilleure vie. Merci.
The honourable member for Prince Albert.
Mr. Speaker, the previous Conservative government was a world leader in providing economic, diplomatic, and military support to our Ukrainian allies. Ukraine's new ambassador to Canada has requested further defensive military equipment to assist in the conflict with Russian forces. President Putin illegally annexed Crimea and continues to place troops in eastern Ukraine. Will the Liberal Minister of National Defence support our allies and provide Ukrainians with the additional military equipment?
Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for the question. Canada does remain committed to Ukrainian partners. We have currently 200 of our brave men and women working alongside the Ukrainian forces in a training role. I'll be attending a very important meeting in Europe with our coalition partners in NATO to discussing the future of what we're going to be doing and how we're going to be continuing to support the Ukraine. Thank you.
Honourable member for Prince Albert.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal Minister of Foreign Affairs stated that Canada and Russia has common interests. Our government was concerned with the freedom and territorial sovereignty of the Ukrainian people. The Liberals are interested in supporting a regime that is currently illegally occupying our Ukrainian ally. Will this Liberal minister continue to enforce and explore additional sanctions on those responsible for the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Donbass?
The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We stand steadfast with Ukraine and will continue to do what we can to support them. The Russian interference and invasion of the Ukrainian territory is completely unacceptable. In case there's any doubt in anyone's mind, the Minister is travelling to Ukraine next week. We are always interested in constructive engagements with other countries and with regard to Russia until it demonstrates full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its neighbours, then we are extremely cautious and completely aligned with the Ukraine.
Honourable member for Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a few weeks ago, the Minister of Finance started fiddling with the mortgage rules because he was concerned that too many Canadians will be tempted to borrow money now while interest rates are low. Can the Minister explain why he thinks low interest rates make it a dangerous time for Canadians to buy homes for their families, but a great time for Liberals to borrow all they want to fund their out-of-control spending?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to say that we took action in December to deal with what we saw as pockets of risk in the Canadian housing market. We understand that Canadians' housing investment is likely the most significant investment that most people will ever make. Up to us to make sure that we protect that by taking prudential measures to look at our housing market. We believe that we've ensured the safety and security of Canadians' investments in their homes.
The member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen and Nicola.
Mr. Speaker, interprovincial trade accounts for 20% of Canada's GDP. The previous Conservative Industry Minister had made interprovincial trade a key file and was able to broker an agreement with all provinces and territories on the need to break down interprovincial trade barriers. Now, unfortunately, the Liberal government makes no mention whatsoever of interprovincial trade in its vaunted mandate letters. Will this government actually make interprovincial trade a real priority, or will they just admit they have no plan to break down these interprovincial trade barriers at a time when the economy needs a boost?
Well, Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Innovation and Science.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the honourable member for his question. Let me make it clear to the honourable member that interprovincial trade is an important priority for this government.
The honourable member for Saskatoon West. Order.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Labour tabled a bill to repeal two anti-union Conservative bills that were adopted to attack workers' rights. Having long fought against the Conservative bills, we welcome this first step. However, major actions were missing in the bill. The Liberals committed to restore good faith bargaining with our public sector service workers. When will the minister restore the sick days benefits and the health and safety provisions for our public sector workers?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for her question. Our government is re-establishing a culture of respect for Canada's public service. We are working closely with our public service, and unlike the previous government, we will not prejudice the bargaining process. We're going to respect the bargaining process, and we're going to negotiate in good faith. At the same time, our government is investing in jobs and growth with a progressive mandate to grow the Canadian economy. So we will negotiate, respecting the fact that we are in a tough fiscal situation, and we will do the right thing.
Honourable member for Drummond.
Monsieur le Président, on a changé de gouvernement, mais rien n'a changé pour le français. Le bureau de la traduction continue de se vider. Immigration Canada ne se donne même pas la peine de traduire en français un formulaire en ligne. Et les tests de langue pour les immigrants coûtent plus cher en français qu'en anglais. Après des années de recul sous les conservateurs, ce n'est pourtant pas difficile de faire mieux. Le gouvernement va-t-il enfin corriger le tir? Quel est son plan d'action?
Monsieur le Président, je remercie le collègue à l'opposé pour sa question. Notre gouvernement prend très au sérieux les langues officielles de notre pays. Et c'est clair que nous allons élaborer un nouveau plan feuille de route qui commence en 2018-2013. Et dès cet été, nous allons embarquer en des consultations envers ce processus. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Minister characterized my lack of faith in the government's Senate appointments process as being cynical. Let me suggest today that the antidote to cynicism is transparency. There would certainly be less room for cynicism if the government would stop pretending that keeping Senate appointments under the absolute control of the Prime Minister is the only way to avoid reopening the Constitution. What the Supreme Court actually says in paragraph 50 of its Senate reference is that the Prime Minister's monopoly is only a non-justiciable constitutional convention. So why doesn't the government just admit the obvious? It doesn't want Senate reform. It wants to restore absolute control to the Prime Minister.
Honourable Parliament Secretary for the Minister of Democratic
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for his question, and I do understand the nature of his cynicism. For 10 years, we saw broken promises and inaction and incredible disappointment when it came from the Senate. In the last election, we promised a new, merit-based, transparent and open process that will allow Canadians from coast to coast to coast to be able to apply and to serve this great country. I'm immensely confident in that process, and I would suggest to the member that he share that confidence and take a look at how the process will work, take a look at the eminent Canadians who are leading it, take a look at the incumbents that will come out of it.
Member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston. Order.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I certainly won't be looking at the list of nominees because that's a secret. There's a great deal there would be a great deal less cynicism about the Senate appointment process if the list of nominees were not be treated like a state secret. The parliamentary secretary's excuse is that nominees who don't get chosen might face job repercussions. He actually said that. No doubt this explains why the Academy Awards wisely keep secret the list of actors to be nominated for Best Actor, Best Supporting Actor, and so on. So isn't it just obvious that the only person who's being sheltered from job repercussions is the Prime Minister, who is being sheltered from the public criticism that he'll face when he bypasses the best candidate selected by the nomination committees in favour of the one that suits him best?
Parliament Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I find the comparison between an executive search for the greatest Canadians, many of whom are in sensitive jobs and in precarious situations to explore new forms of employment, to Hollywood movies, which obviously love promotion and love the fact that they're put out there. Mr. Speaker, this process, which will be led by Canadians of enormous distinction, will ensure that the greatest Canadians from coast to coast to coast are able to apply, are able to be considered, and I have enormous confidence, as I'm sure once the member sees the outcome of the process and who is appointed, that this process will invigorate the Senate with a new merit-based process.
Honourable member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Mr. Speaker, I will never, ever, ever know whether the best people were chosen because that will be a big, fat secret. Mr. Speaker, as for the question of electoral reform, last June the Prime Minister told Maclean's that, and I quote him, "It hasn't gone unnoticed by people that electoral reform has had a lot of trouble getting through plebiscites." Now, of course, the evidence from New Zealand would suggest otherwise. Still, this is the reason given by the Prime Minister for not holding a referendum. So who's truly cynical? Those who want the Canadian people to make the final choice, or a Prime Minister who won't give Canadians a vote because they may not approve of the electoral system that he personally has designed for them, and probably as well for his party's own advantage?
Secretary to the Minister of Democratic Institutions.
I welcome the member's enthusiasm, his newfound enthusiasm opposite for public engagement. The reality is, for over a decade, we heard about transformation of our electoral system or transformation of the Senate, and we saw only great disappointment and broken promises. In the short time that we've been in office, we've already described a robust plan to engage Canadians from coast to coast to make sure their voices are heard in keeping our commitment to end the first-past-the-post system and ensure that every Canadian, no matter who they are, gets the opportunity to express their democratic will.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many registered charities have seen their important work impeded by the former government's decision to audit them for political activities. In many cases, these charitable organizations felt that the reason for which they were being audited was because they disagreed with the policies of the government at the time. Can the Minister of National Revenue update this House on the Canada Revenue Agency's Political Activities Audit Program? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable ministre du Revenu national.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Notre gouvernement reconnaît le rôle essentiel que les organismes de bienfaisance jouent dans la société et leur contribution politique et au débat public. L'indépendance de l'Agence du revenu du Canada dans son rôle de surveillance est un principe fondamental qui doit être protégé. C'est pourquoi, en tant que ministre du Revenu national, je ne jouerai pas un rôle de sélection des vérifications à effectuer, ni dans les décisions liées aux résultats de ces vérifications.
The honourable member for Yorkton-Melville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For decades, the Canadian Armed Forces have issued record of service ID cards to members when they left the military. Tens of thousands of veterans use this card with employers, legions, and veteran-friendly establishments around the world. This Liberal government is eliminating this ID card and replacing it with a gimmicky discount card. Why would this government take away IDs held by thousands of Canadian veterans and cheapen their service by replacing them with an inferior commercial card?
The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Monsieur le Président, I would like to thank the Honourable Member for her question. This is simply a transition with technology. We are upgrading the card that we will be offering to veterans once they leave the Canadian Forces. It will give them more options, it will provide more service, and it is a step in the right direction. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for St. John's East.
Mr. Speaker, transnational criminal organizations cause enormous harm around the world. Canada has a tradition of participating in international efforts to stem the tide against organized crime, whether at home or abroad. Can the Minister of National Defence inform the House of the government's latest initiative to help disrupt illicit trafficking operations at sea?
Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for the question. I have seen the terrible damage inflicted onto Canadian cities and citizens caused by organized crime and their business in drug trafficking. This year's record success on Operation Période is a testament to the Canadian Armed Forces, and particularly the Royal Canadian Navy, the Royal Canadian Air Force's dedication and perseverance to work with our allies in complex environments for the safety and security of the citizens of this continent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cariboo, Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, while this Liberal government is busy brainstorming ways to add more and more red tape to discourage resource development and investment in this country, they have forgotten we currently stand without a Canada-U.S. softwood lumber agreement. An agreement that ended costly trade disputes between Canada and the U.S. and ensured 145,000 forestry jobs are protected in BC. Will anyone from this government please stand up and tell us why they aren't fighting for the hard-working Canadians employed in the forestry sector? Anyone.
The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. The softwood lumber dispute between Canada and the United States is a priority for our government. It is a question that has been raised at the very highest levels, Mr. Speaker. We are consulting stakeholders. We are consulting the provinces. The minister has met with Premier Christy Clark of British Columbia. The Prime Minister and the minister have had conversations with their counterparts in the United States, and we will do our best to ensure that there was softwood access to the American market. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président, comme on l'a appris cette semaine, le bilinguisme institutionnel mis de l'avant par le gouvernement fédéral fait en sorte que 60% des nouveaux arrivants non francophones au Québec considèrent qu'il n'est pas nécessaire de connaître le français pour travailler et vivre à Montréal. La ministre du Patrimoine réalise-t-elle qu'au Québec, la politique de bilinguisme institutionnel contribue à l'anglicisation des nouveaux arrivants et menace l'avenir du français au Québec?
Secrétaire parlementaire de la ministre du Patrimoine canadien.
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais remercier mon collègue de sa question. Notre gouvernement est extrêmement fier de notre réputation internationale en ce qui concerne le bilinguisme officiel. C'est un gouvernement libéral qui a mis cette politique en place et c'est un gouvernement libéral qui va nettoyer 10 ans d'ignorance du gouvernement conservateur passé pour améliorer les conditions des francophones en situation minoritaire et des anglophones en situation minoritaire au Québec. Monsieur le Président, c'est notre charge, on le prend au sérieux.
Monsieur le Président, une nouvelle étude vient de confirmer ce qu'on savait déjà depuis longtemps, c'est-à-dire que le bilinguisme individuel se retrouve principalement au Québec. Est-ce que la ministre du Patrimoine trouve acceptable que la ville d'Ottawa, la capitale du Canada, qui se tarde d'être un beau grand pays bilingue, coast to coast to coast, refuse depuis des années de se doter du statut bilingue?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Monsieur le Président, en ce qui concerne le bilinguisme officiel du pays, nous le prenons en charge. Nous respectons la juridiction de chaque ordre du gouvernement dans ce pays. Et en ce qui concerne le bilinguisme d'une ville, ça, c'est à leurs conseillers de décider, c'est à leur maire de décider. Et nous allons travailler de côte à côte de notre grand pays pour encourager n'importe quelle ville qui veut de devenir bilingue. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Monsieur le Président, mardi dernier, c'était au tour de Françoise Bertrand, présidente de la Fédération des chambres de commerce du Québec, de prendre la plume pour dénoncer l'entêtement fédéral de vouloir créer une commission canadienne des valeurs mobilières. Madame Bertrand parle d'une mauvaise idée dont l'utilité a été artificiellement inventée par Ottawa et qui aurait des conséquences graves sur l'économie du Québec. Ma question est à savoir, en fait, si le ministre peut nous dire pourquoi le gouvernement tient tant à dépouiller Montréal de son secteur financier et de ses leviers de décision.
L'honorable ministre des Finances.
Mr. Speaker, we will respect the 2011 Supreme Court ruling on this issue. We will respect the rights of all provinces to decide whether or not they'd like to be part of a national securities regulator. We will move forward with those provinces that are willing because we believe that it creates some efficiency in our country around this issue, and we respect that other provinces may decide to go alone.
Yeah. That will conclude question period for today.